Welcome to Reflections, an occasional series of conversations in which we bring our research-based expertise to bear on interesting and important topical questions. My name is Dan Brinks, and I'm privileged to be the chair of the government department at the University of Texas at Austin. My own research is in comparative law and politics, but one of the joys of leading this great department is that I get to hear about all the research that our excellent faculty are doing on all kinds of different issues. Today, I'm joined by Professors Rob Moser and Pat McDonald to talk about COVID, globalization, and US foreign policy. Professor Rob Moser specializes in the study of electoral systems, political parties, ethnicity and elections, and women's and minority representation, and Russian politics. Professor McDonald teaches primarily courses on international relations theory, international political economy, international security. His current research focuses on the economic causes of war and peace. Together, Professors Moser and McDonald have been teaching a really popular course on American foreign policy, one that enrolls thousands of students every year. And this year, to no surprise, that course includes a section on how COVID is affecting our foreign policy and the world system itself. So I thought we could have a conversation about that, COVID, globalization, US foreign policy, and see what you all have to share with our audience. So I think from the little bit that we talked about before we started recording, that you're going to tell me that the heyday of globalization may be over. We may be looking at a less globalized world going forward. So can you tell me first what you mean by globalization and why I should care if it's over?
So you want me to start, Rob?
Yeah, go ahead.
So the way I think about globalization is simply it's a process that reflects the integration of national markets into a larger global marketplace. And since at least 1945, this has been fueled largely by the reduction of barriers to trade. So this was politically led, but also driven by technological gains that reduce the cost of moving goods and services across national boundaries, or if we think about the internet, reduce the cost of trading services across national boundaries. And so we have this broader set of pressures, market pressures associated with globalization that really change how we interact with each other, that make it easier to communicate and move people across large distances, and really expose domestic markets to the pressures that emanate from other economies, say lower wages and lower price levels in other countries can then be felt in the United States through globalization. And so we think about globalization as linked to higher levels of aggregate trade, higher levels of capital flows, the creation of global supply chains, lots of migration, the movement of people across national boundaries. It accentuates the trade-offs between domestic monetary autonomy and the ability of central banks to set interest rates and exchange rate stability. It's associated with urbanization. And I think what's really important when we start moving to thinking about US politics and the consequences of globalization, it's associated with something called factor price convergence, which ultimately shifts the distribution of income within societies and triggers what we might think of as backlash from globalization. So this more broadly is a set of economic pressures that we often associate with globalization.
So you should care about globalization, I would say, because globalization represents the current interconnected state of our global economy and world. The reason you have a cell phone that you can afford is partly because of globalization, because they make all the different parts in so many different places in the world, and they take advantage of the comparative skills and resources of so many different countries that what globalization does for consumers is it drives prices down. It helps with innovation, it helps with collaboration, it's a driver for this kind of creative destruction. But then, of course, as Pat said, it also has these trade-offs where, you know, what you were able to do in the United States in terms of certain employment opportunities like manufacturing jobs, those go away because there's cheaper places to make cars and other goods because of lower labor costs. So that's why we should care. It has
And-
huge impacts on us economically, politically, even culturally because of this interconnectedness.
And let me just add one thing to this. Globalization, right, renders the United States dependent and vulnerable on what happens around the world at the same time, right? And we can think about the consequences of COVID here, right? COVID was transmitted outward and spread across the world through the mechanisms that we associate with globalization, including very dense transportation networks. And at the same time, the responses of governments to COVID have really attacked some of the foundations of globalization.
Right.
Right. So,
And one final note about
yeah.
globalization has made the United States incredibly powerful too. I mean, the United States was a founder of the current global economic order. And so the United States not only has been, and you get a lot of the message of the downside of American hegemony and leadership, but we benefited a lot economically, politically from this interconnectedness.
So oddly, I hear you saying both things, right? It makes us stronger. It makes us as consumers, in a sense, wealthier because we can have a higher standard of living for less money. It also makes us weaker. It makes us more vulnerable to things that are happening out in the world in other places. And it affects some people in our society very directly and very negatively, right? Because some people are going to lose their jobs. And so that's maybe what's behind the backlash that you were talking about, Pat, a little bit ago. So what about that backlash, and how is the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, going to affect the politics around globalization and the politics of trade and multilateralism and even our own economy?
So we should talk about this in economic and political terms. Rob, which one do you want to take? You want to take the economic or the political?
Political.
All right, so I'll start economically. If we think about the response of governments, the immediate response of governments to COVID was to put brakes on some of the engines of globalization. So the first thing was to close borders to national travel, to limit travel abroad, limit tourism, which had huge consequences on many countries around the world. But this then also influenced supply chains. And there was this secondary set of pressures whereby government said, particularly when it came to medical supplies, or supplies of PPE, we can't be dependent on other countries for providing ventilators or PPE. And so there's been this pressure, this criticism of global supply chains that were made vulnerable through COVID. And so governments are now talking about creating sets of incentives to bring manufacturing back. When Rob and I were teaching our class on US foreign policy, so we gave a lecture on the politics of COVID on, what was it, February 27th. So it was 2 days into the collapse in the US stock market. And one of the things—
Way ahead of our time, baby.
One of the things that struck me that was eye-opening. So we spent a weekend reading about this, and both of us then went, whoa, this is more serious than we understood. And one of the things that stuck with me was the discussion of, I think it was Hyundai that we talked about, and how factories in South Korea had to shut down because factories in Wuhan shut down because of COVID. And so all of a sudden, right, there's no more cars being manufactured in South Korea, huge damage to their supply chains because they couldn't get parts out of China. And so then this consequence of this first shutdown in Wuhan, which is at the end of January, is then reverberating outward and shaping the ability of Hyundai to meet their quarterly profits, to employ people, which then is going to be felt in American automobile markets within a couple of months. And that's when I saw that happen, I started to realize that the economic consequences of the government response to this, which is short-term temporary shutdowns, were going to reverberate much more broadly in the international system.
Yeah, and you think about it, it wasn't just a supply problem. It was a demand problem as well, right? And so you shut down the economy, and this shows the multiple layers of the interconnectedness, right? I mean, shutting down the American economy to combat COVID was going to hurt Chinese factories too, not only because they couldn't build cars, but even when they could start building cars again because they got the infection under control, nobody was buying cars. And so the demand collapsed. And, you know, you see this in American domestic economies with the collapse of the service sector, but this has a global impact too, because there's, you know, it's happening simultaneously all around the world. And so on the political side, I would say you can see a couple things. One is international, and then the other is domestic, right? And at the international level, there's some real reputational costs here for how individual countries have been able to manage the outbreak of infections, right? And so the United States in particular has seen the highest number of infections, highest number of deaths in the world. And because we were and are the strongest country politically, economically, et cetera, in the world, that's a real surprising outcome, right? And so looking forward, that will have some legacy effects, I think, in terms of the ability for the United States to continue to lead in global international organizations and politically around the world. So that's going to be a reputational cost. And then there's the domestic consequences. And so, you know, as a good compare to this, I've been following elections around the world. And so New Zealand just had an election. And so COVID-19 and your reaction to COVID-19 doesn't necessarily doom an incumbent government. The Prime Minister and her Labour Party in New Zealand, what's her name? Her name is Jacinda Ardern. Yeah, Jacinda Ardern. She had a, you know, dominant re-election, and the Labour Party in New Zealand now can govern solo in the New Zealand Parliament because they won so many seats, because she was perceived by the population as being so effective in tackling that coronavirus. On the other hand, I'd say it was unclear who was going to win, and it's still unclear who is going to win the elections in the United States in a couple weeks. But there's no doubt in my mind that the negative perception of the reaction to COVID-19, especially after President Trump got infected with the virus himself, and there was a whole circle within the White House that the virus spread. It kind of went counter to the narrative that he had been arguing about the severity of the pandemic, that's going to hurt President Trump's reelection prospects and the Republican Party's reelection prospects. And that domestic political implication of COVID-19 around the world is going to have different implications. I mean, the United States will have a very different foreign policy if not only Joe Biden wins election, but if the Democrats would win in the Senate and hold the House. I mean, that's a whole different kind of global approach to the world by the United States under a Biden administration with a Democratic unified governance than if the Trump administration had no COVID to deal with, could tout a thriving stock market, and could have made a pretty strong reelection campaign to maintain power. So it really makes or breaks administrations around the world.
So let's play that out a little bit. I mean, we don't, obviously it's 2 weeks to the election. We don't know how it's going to go, but there have been already suggestions by different people that it's possible that the Democrats could retake the Senate, win the presidency, and have the House. How do you see such an outcome affecting globalization I mean, just generally, I mean, we're an important player. We're obviously not the only player in the world, but we're an important player. What happens to the global system if the election goes that way?
I'll start and then maybe, so I would say there's specific and narrow differences, and then there's broader consequences that would suggest continuity rather than a break with the previous administration. In terms of, the partisan differences between a Biden presidency and the Trump presidency, Donald Trump clearly constructed a coalition against globalization and against multilateral organizations and multilateral cooperation with the world. The America First foreign policy was a reaction against Obama and previous mainstream Democrat and Republican administrations that embraced American hegemony, embraced American leadership in organizations like NATO, the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and the like. And the Trump administration pulled back from all of that, saying that those were burdensome and were institutions that put the United States at a disadvantage and allowed other countries to take advantage of the United States. And so if you have a democratic unified government, what I would say is that the United States would re-enter the Paris Climate Accord. They basically stated that that's what they plan to do. You might have a re-engagement with Iran over controlling nuclear weapons and some sort of either renegotiated or re-established nuclear agreement there. You will have definitely rhetorical, but I would say practical and policy-oriented changes with the U.S. Relations with NATO allies, strengthening those, reestablishing those on what Biden kind of characterizes as the previous way under the Obama administration and all the administrations prior to that. And so all of those things would be a sharp turn sort of away from the Trump administration foreign policy of retrenchment and skepticism about all of those engagements, and going sort of back in the terminology of Biden to the previous era, to kind of turn it back. I would say that would be the short-term differences, and they're significant, but then I would say there's probably long-term pressures that would limit those, and I'll let
So that's a pretty significant difference, right? That's the difference between a worldview that says we're better off if we do things on our own, to a worldview that says we're actually better off if we're part of multilateral efforts to accomplish whatever it is we're trying to do.
I agree, and it just emphasizes how important elections are and how important individual leaders and politicians are. I mean, the real change, I would say, came with the election of Donald Trump, and because that foreign policy was a departure. If you look even at the Republican primary election, contest, most of the Republicans like Jeb Bush and the others were more in line with a multilateral, especially free trade kind of approach than than Donald Trump, or on the other end of the spectrum, Bernie Sanders.
So let me just jump in here and think about this in a slightly different way, but that I want to emphasize the important role that globalization here plays in US national politics. And the way that I increasingly think about this is in terms of the politics of triangulation. And so we need to so we can understand something about the contest between Republicans and Democrats right now in terms of their broader foreign policy orientation. And leaders will leverage conflict in the international environment to build a domestic coalition. And so during the Cold War, right, and we talk about globalization, why did globalization flourish after 1945? Well, there was an overarching narrative that we had a bipartisan consensus between Republicans and Democrats that the Soviets were bad. And so we're going to have lots of trade with Western Europe and Japan and East Asia to bind them to the United States, to create this community around common economic and political interests. And that complementarity or that consensus about the nature of the international threat then reduces distributional concerns that are now really the focus of the backlash against globalization. So Democrats and Republicans aren't worried about, for example, in the early 1950s, about Western Europeans having an undervalued exchange rate that's undermining the competitiveness of US exporters, because this is about building common economic ties against the Soviet Union. Now, after the Cold War ends, we get this continuation of these neoliberal ideals. And both center-right and center-left politicians in the United States aren't worried about their flanks. They're not worried about the long-term domestic sustainability, the political sustainability of globalization. And this creates an opportunity for Donald Trump, right? Where he recreates a completely new narrative about the US role in the world, which is the rest of the world has been taking advantage of the United States, and this hurts American workers. And I'm going to carve out a new coalition that's oriented around pushing back against multilateral organizations, pushing back against globalization, and our new adversary is China. Now, what he did then was peel off part of the Democratic coalition that was anti-globalization, and at the same time, he's recreated a new coalition within the Republican Party based on this narrative. The center-right is gone. And there's much more support for isolationism, a pushback against international institutions, and a resistance to globalization. And so in the long run, right, what's happened is we now have the return of isolationism in the United States, which even if Biden returns us to the grand strategies pursued by the two Bushes, by Obama, and by Clinton, there isn't long-term support for that, I think, in the Republican coalition. And this is going to leave the United States pushed and pulled between two very competing and different tendencies over the next couple of decades. And that's going to shape how the rest of the world looks at us, looks at our elections, and is then willing or not to get into new international agreements with the United States. Because while Biden might want to flirt with the Iran nuclear accord, how are moderates in Iran going to want to make new concessions to the United States if they're just going to be overturned in 2024 by the next Republican administration? Same thing with respect to China.
So that's really interesting, right? So a lot of people have been talking about the post-war set of institutions that kept us basically on the same course, right, since the 1940s and 50s. And you're saying that really rested on a cross-party consensus that institutional framework was the best way to advance our interests in the world. And now what we've had is a sort of splitting where we have one party that still believes in it. I'm going to ask you a question about that in a second. And another part, right, that would be the Democrats, right, and Biden, particularly the center kind of wing of the Democrats. And then you have the Republicans who, in your sort of description just now, have sort of abandoned that, right? Either under Trump or whoever would follow him in the next election, right? So I wonder though if we haven't built a new consensus, right? A new consensus around worker protection, a new consensus around pushing back against international markets, pushing back against, all the economic pressures that you were talking about that were creating the backlash to begin with, and a renewed concern for a distributional politics, maybe not so much global distribution, but at least within each economy, right? Like, aren't we in a new world that is just a little bit more economically nationalist, right, than it was 4 years ago, regardless of who wins, regardless of which party is in power?
Yeah, so I would agree with that. I think there's support for that in both parties in the United States, but it's two very different visions about how you achieve that within the parties. So on the Democratic side, support for workers' rights, but there's also, I think, a willingness to engage in multilateral cooperation that reaffirms international organizations and international agreements that are designed to protect workers' rights. On the Republicans, right, on the Republican side, Trump's coalition clearly wants to promote workers' interests, right? And tariffs and protectionism is about protecting the manufacturing sector and helping manufacturing workers. But there's much less willingness to work through multilateral institutional forums at the international level on that side. Instead, what President Trump wants to do is leverage US market power to engage in bilateral negotiations that are designed to benefit the US in the short and the medium run. The problem is those won't sustain larger multilateral cooperation over the long run.
So,
Right.
so
Well,
that,
that's exactly
go ahead.
the way Bernie Sanders articulated it in the campaign, right? He said, basically, well, Donald Trump has a good point about the problem with with these multilateral, multinational trade agreements. They're bad for our workers. He just goes about trying to solve those things in a unstrategic and negative way. And so, but what I don't see in the Democratic Party in that whole new consensus about protecting workers' rights is an alternative to that confrontation with the adversary like China. I mean, I think at least it's not very detailed yet. It's this idea that, well, you have to bring all the actors and stakeholders on board, right? In any future, trade pact negotiation, you got to bring labor, you got to bring environmentalists and stuff. But
right. So I guess the difference might be either we, under a Republican approach, we would write a bunch of bilateral trade agreements that we see as favoring our interests. And under the Democratic approach, I suppose what you would do is try to incorporate things like labor protections, environmental protections, all those sorts of things into the multilateral agreements themselves, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And I think, and the other thing though, in all this, and as you were talking, Dan, that made me, the challenge for politicians on both sides that are internationalist is nobody's going to want to invest a lot of political capital in embracing globalization. And so in order to get these multilateral agreements that say liberalize trade barriers, you need some set of domestic goodies that allow you to say that you're doing something, that this is consistent with what your domestic supporters want. And that's going to be tricky for everyone. And in light of what's going on, it's going to be hard to identify those goodies. I mean, maybe in something like a Green New Deal, where Biden leverages, tries to build support from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and then tries to link domestic spending on that's about facilitating an economic recovery to some broader set of international agreements, say re-entry into the Paris Climate Accords. I mean, that's a possibility, but I think in order to think about the sustainability of globalization in the long run, we've got to think about how do we square the domestic politics on this to make sure that we are, in a sense, creating stakeholders in the domestic environment that are willing to sign off on what will ultimately be some set of concessions to international actors.
Yeah, and I don't see how, given the current economic status quo with incredible economic contraction and everything that came with COVID, that there's going to be a natural inward-looking approach to politics all around the world, including the United States. We're not going to spend a lot of money on anything international when we have, millions and millions and millions of people out of work. There's going to be this natural retrenchment mentality and saying, look, our biggest problems are domestic.
Mm-hmm. So we've been the leader, and now it looks like for a bunch of different reasons, we may not be occupying that space anymore in terms of building and sustaining and even funding multilateral agreements and organizations, right? Whether it's because, they don't know what's going to happen with the next election, or because we've all turned inward because we have to worry about our own people, or whatever it is. So the question, who wins then? Does the international just go away, or do other actors come in and occupy the spot that we were occupying before.
Pat thinks that China wins.
No, I didn't say that. I think
Sorry, I couldn't.
no, that's okay. But I think, right, so we joke, but right, today, new data is coming out of China suggesting that their economic recovery is going to be faster. They're going to have growth this year, real growth, right?
Like
where
5% growth in this latest quarter, right?
Yeah, I think the estimate was 5% growth for the year, and this is after the slowdown in Q1 in China. And so we're not going to get back to economic growth in the United States, right? The recoveries in Q3 and Q4 isn't going to be larger than the decline in Q2. And, you know, in the long run, those aren't good trends for the United States.
Yeah, so I kid about this, but I could, it's not completely clear that, say, China is going to be a stronger power because of this, but I do think it's a pretty compelling argument that the countries that brought the infections under control earlier and more effectively are going to bounce back earlier and more completely economically, and then they'll have an advantage. That doesn't only mean China, but that's the largest economy that has managed to control it. And you can quibble about the numbers, right? Maybe they're not reporting all their cases, but they're not, you know, they don't have 10 times as many cases as they're reporting. I mean, they've had fewer infections, they've had lots fewer deaths. But other countries too, Germany, South Korea, you know, those countries are going to do better. Now, those countries are smaller than China. So China is, if it doesn't, you know, if it maintains control over the virus, is going to be better off. I mean, I kind of have a hard time seeing how that couldn't be the case.
No, and I think I would say, in terms of the broader question, who wins here in the end? For me, what's really important is it's the match or mismatch between what the domestic politics will tolerate and the scope of international commitments that the United States has. And so, after 1945, there's a match between these two. There's a domestic consensus, in part shaped by economic interests, where the Republicans moved from being isolationists to embracing multilateralism and globalization. And so the US trades with Western Europe, and this is a foundation for the long-term containment strategy in the United States. And we're at a period now, and it reflects the larger disagreement within American politics, where we have a mismatch between what the US public will tolerate and the scope of international commitments. You know, the Iran nuclear accord is an example of this mismatch, right? Obama didn't want to make concessions to the right that opposed the Iran nuclear accord. He makes it anyway. He, you know, implements it through executive action. And guess what? The next Republican president withdraws from it and creates long-term doubts then about American willingness to uphold multilateral agreements. This is, you know, whether or not you agreed or disagreed with it, the point is domestic disagreements undermine the long-term sustainability of US commitments. And the US is in a much better situation when it makes an international agreement, and then that agreement isn't vulnerable to changes in our elections. That was the case in the Cold War, a little bit in the 1990s, but this, right, I think the war in Iraq really upends this and begins the process of reorienting the Republican Party. And now we've got deeper polarization, and it's going to be much more difficult for the US to manage its relationships with the world over the next decade or two. And that's a problem because the international status quo right now, as it's negotiated, rests on US leadership. And so ultimately this back and forth domestically in the United States, it's not just going to lead to unpredictability in US politics. It has the risk of being destabilizing more broadly in the international system, right? Angela Merkel in Germany is saying, we can't trust the United States anymore. Europe has to carve out a new way. It has to reorient its foreign policy from 1945 because we don't know what's going to happen in US politics anymore. That's significant.
So that's probably a good place to stop. I think we're out of time. It sounds, just to quickly recap our conversation, it sounds like we've sort of lost that bipartisan consensus that was sustaining this globalized world order, right? And what we're looking at in US domestic politics is a lot of uncertainty about our role in the world and how we're going to sustain our commitment so that even if we go back with, say, a Biden administration or a fully democratic government, even if we go back to some sort of multilateral engagement, it's not obvious that the US will be able to sustain its leadership role over time. It's not obvious that the rest of the world is going to trust us enough to allow us to maintain that position. And so there's just a lot of uncertainty going forward for globalization. And what COVID did was to just speed everything up.
Yeah, and you got to hope that regardless of what the outcome of the election is, that there's some stable outcome and not a chaotic and, really, even contested kind of thing that drives on and on, because that's just going to further raise questions about American leadership in the world as well. So,
right. All right. Well, thank you so much. And Pat McDonald and Rob Moser, two professors in the government department.
Thanks. It was my pleasure. It was fun to go back and forth about this with both of you.
A lot of fun.